We see Jackie Robinson, like you mentioned, he's the first African-American inducted into the Hall of Fame. That was in 1962.
Right.
Then we see a gap where no other players are inducted. What was going on behind the scenes after Jackie Robinson? Were there people pushing for more Black players to be included, other movements going on to try and build on that momentum?
Yeah, there were. There, at kind of hand in hand with the push for integration was a push for the Hall of Fame to also integrate. So you saw that a lot in the Black media, the Pittsburgh Courier, which had Wendell Smith writing for it, and the Chicago Defender, and Sam Lacey was another Black writer who was writing about it. And they were advocating for the integration of baseball, but also saying, hey, these are Hall of Fame worthy players already playing, the Josh Gibsons and Buck Leonards of the world, Satchel Paige and so forth. So they've just continued that push once integration actually happened. And then others started slowly joining that. Some white writers started joining that. There was a guy named Dave Condon who wrote for a column for the Chicago Tribune. He was particularly vocal about making that point. And Bob Feller, of all people, spoke up on behalf of Satchel Paige, who was his teammate at one point, despite the fact that he had not been great in his relations with the Black players that he'd been teammates with Larry Doby, with Satchel Paige. There had been a lot of tension there. He, at one point, said he didn't think Jackie Robinson would make it in baseball. He didn't believe that he had the skill set to do it. He was a controversial guy on this particular subject, but he stood up for Satchel Paige's inclusion in the Hall of Fame right around the time that he was elected, which ironically was 1962, the same year as Jackie Robinson. So there was a little bit of that, but the real push came when Ted Williams, in his induction in 1966, literally on the steps of the Hall of Fame, said that he felt there was a place for the Josh Gibsons and Satchel Paiges of the world. And the Hall of Fame really couldn't ignore it at that point, since he literally said it with all of their leadership behind it. And at that point, the wheels started turning a little bit more. You started getting folks like Dick Young, a very influential writer, columnist for the New York Daily News, threw his weight behind that in his columns. And then Bowie Kuhn, who was the new commissioner in the late 60s, had been a fan of the Homestead Grays growing up in Washington, D.C., where the Grays played half of their games. He'd been a scoreboard operator and had watched those games at Griffith Stadium, and he got behind it as well. And they all kind of then pulled together to push the Hall of Fame leadership, which included Ford Frick at that point. He had stopped being president of the National League and then commissioner of baseball. And by this point, he was chairman of the board of the Hall. And was still opposed to having Negro Leaguers in, but that conglomeration of folks kind of finally pushed him to do the right thing.
So who were some of the Negro League players that benefited from this push after Jackie Robinson was inducted, who were able to finally get their names in the Hall?
Yeah, it was when they first decided to do it, they were going to do it in not the greatest way, in very much a separate but equal way. They said, we'll put in basically an all-star team. We'll put in one person per position. They kind of fudged it ultimately by putting Martin Dihigo in as a second baseman when he really wasn't. But that's essentially what they did. They were going to put them all in as one big display, not as actual Hall of Famers with their own individual plaques in the plaque room. They were going to have a separate place to honor them. And when that became clear, and after this special committee was formed and picked Satchel Paige as the first one, and it became clear that that was how he was going to go in, he very famously said, I'd love to go in the Hall of Fame, but I'm not going in the back door. And lots of media members and whatnot basically said the same thing, that you're essentially segregating the Hall of Fame. Sure, you're letting them in, but it's separate but equal. You're not putting them in as equals of the same of the white players who'd been in before. Right. They changed that, thankfully, and did put those players in as individuals, so that you finally got that first wave of Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson and Buck Leonard and Cool Papa Bell and those guys. But they were essentially an all-star team, one per position. The bad part about that is that, for instance, because one pitcher was already in, Satchel Paige, they couldn't put in Bullet Rogan, for instance, because another ridiculously good Negro pitcher was not able to be put in the Hall of Fame, because the way they decided to do it was, no, we were only having one per position. They could have put Bullet Rogan as an outfielder, but they already kind of had that slotted for the Monty Irvins and Cool Papa Bells of the world. So he wound up not getting in that first wave. He might have been the best Negro Leagues player ever. Certainly in terms of like a Shohei Ohtani, he could do both. He could pitch and hit ridiculously well, but he had to be skipped because of how they decided to structure that first wave of inductees.
And there seems to be more waves that occurred after this, initial push at the end of the 60s. So there was another crop of players that were inducted in the 1970s. We saw another small batch in the 1990s. Was there anything behind those movements as well, or was it just momentum from that first expansion?
No, there was the Hall of Fame's been very clear that they are an organization that will follow public opinion. They are there to the way I wrote it in the book was that they want to reflect public opinion as opposed to making the public reflect. They're not doing anything that's going to be outside of the mainstream. So putting that first wave of players in the early 70s came on the heels of the civil rights movement. Yeah. That next they only put in two more players or one player and one pioneer, Rube Foster, throughout the entire rest of from like 77 to 95, they only put in two more. But what happened in the early 90s was the baseball documentary that Ken Burns did, which got an enormous amount of publicity, particularly for the Negro Leagues, because Buck O'Neil was such a great spokesperson for the Negro Leagues in that series. And that got an additional upgrade of attention to the Negro Leagues, which caused them to say, okay, we'll augment the Veterans Committee elections each year by making them have one extra spot available solely for Negro Leaguers. So there was a string of 7 years in a row from like 96 to 02 or something like that, where they put in one extra Negro Leaguer. And then in 06 is when they decided, okay, let's finish this off finally. The Buck O'Neills of the world are not going to stop advocating for this. And they said they would create their own special committee, populate it with researchers and scholars, people who are experts on the Negro Leagues, a couple of players as well, and say, let's put in as many as you can. That's when they got their big election of 17 members of the Negro League. Most of those were players, but some of them were owners as well. And since then, they haven't elected a player since. They've put in Bud Fowler, who's pre-Negro Leagues, and they put in Buck O'Neil, both of those in 2022, but both of them went in as pioneers. No player or umpire or manager has been elected to the Hall of Fame from the Negro League since that big 06 class.
Who would be on the top of your list of players that have not been inducted yet that should be in the Hall of Fame?
Well, they keep nominating John Donaldson, and they should, because he was a ridiculously good pitcher. He was the guy who kind of bridged that time from before the Negro Leagues into the Negro Leagues. He was very a big attraction during barnstorming. He sort of helped create barnstorming and innovated as the business model for how these black teams could not only play a lot of games, but make a lot of money. Before the organization of the Negro National League in 1920, they didn't have a league to rest, on and have a schedule and draw fans and whatnot. They had to go out and find those fans and play in front of whoever they could play in front of. And so this barnstorming model, and John Donaldson was one of the main people responsible for that, was incredibly important. On top of which he threw 14 no-hitters and had 5,000 strikeouts and things like that, none of which can really be verified, unfortunately, because this is pre-league days and a lot of the numbers are against town teams and not well documented and things like that. But he is such a big presence in the formation of the Negro Leagues themselves, but also in that history of black baseball prior to the Negro Leagues that he should be in. And I would argue for Vic Harris, because he was not just a very good player for the Homestead Grays, but he was their manager for most of their great years, and easily is qualified as a manager by the Hall of Fame standards for managers, which is, anybody who's ever won 4 pennants as a manager is in the Hall of Fame, with one exception, and that's Vic Harris. Vic Harris is, he won 7 pennants. He has a better winning percentage than Dave Roberts, who is the all-time major league record holder. And yet he's not in the Hall of Fame. And that's because no black manager from the Negro Leagues is in the Hall of Fame. There are people who managed in the Negro Leagues who are in the Hall of Fame, but not for managing. Oscar Charleston, for instance, is in as a great center fielder, which he was. He also managed, but he's not in for his managing. And Rube Foster is in as the executive who founded the league, also a great manager, but he's not in for his managing. So those would be, they were both on the Veterans Committee, or ERAS committee ballot, I guess it is now. This year, they were both passed over, unfortunately. They won't even be eligible for another 3 years because of the way that these ERAS committees rotate which groups are looked at. So they're two glaring omissions. I did write a piece about it on my Substack account. There's probably 15 or so black players or managers who are easily qualified. And if they would ever do another exercise to kind of true up that time period, it would be worthy, and they would find plenty of folks who are certainly qualified.